Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today for New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center Fall Climate Academy event on promoting nature-based hazard mitigation through FEMA grants. My name is Carrie Ferraro, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. A few logistics. Today's webinar will last until 1 p.m. Other than today's presenters and our Rutgers team, you're all muted. So to communicate with us, please type your questions into the chat box. To find the chat box, look at the bottom of the screen and you'll see a little button that says chat. And if you click on that, you can send us questions and comments. Please be sure to send all notes to panelists, as this will ensure that all of us working behind the scenes here can see your questions. We have a lot of speakers and panelists today. I also wanted to let you know that we are recording today's webinar and it will be available on the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center website, which I'll put into the chat in a minute. One certification maintenance credit is available through the American Planning Association, and one continuing education credit has been requested, has also been made available through the Association of State Floodplain Management. If you're interested in these certification credits, please reach out to us after the webinar. Today, we have some wonderful speakers from AECOM and the Nature Conservancy. And we have, since there's a number of them, I won't go into their bios, but I encourage you to check out our website to get more information about them today. Again, I'd like to remind everyone to put your question in the chat box and send it to panelists. And with that, I will turn things over to Chris Levitz from AECOM. So Chris, please feel free to turn on your microphone and your camera.
Thank you, and I'm going to share our presentation. So that should be up. Everybody can see that, hopefully. All right. Well, thank you for the introduction, Carrie, and we're excited to be here presenting with Rutgers and the Nature Conservancy and talking about these nature-based solutions and specifically how to look to get those funded through FEMA mitigation grant process. I'm going to begin the presentation, and I'm going to hand off to Tayler Nordstrom, and she's going to ultimately hand off to Amy Baker. So we've got three of us kind of breaking the presentation up. And as Carrie mentioned, we have some other folks here on the panel as well to answer questions. We're going to take some little breaks between the sections to hopefully touch on maybe some relevant questions. So definitely drop in anything as we go through each of these sections. Drop in your questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to hit up some of those during this, and some of the others we can follow up with after as needed. I also want to thank the Nature Conservancy and also let Patty Dorr from Nature Conservancy in New Jersey say a quick intro as well.
I'll unmute myself first. Thanks, Chris, and thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. Nature Conservancy is really excited about this guidebook. We have a big focus and priority on creating more holistic responses to climate change and the challenges that our communities and cities are facing. And so our hope is this guidebook will help to spur some more funding and write questions to create more holistic nature-based hazard mitigation. So thanks very much. If you have any questions geared towards the Nature Conservancy, I am happy to answer them.
Thank you, Patty. All right, and one other little housekeeping note we have before we get started, we have a couple of poll questions that we wanted to pose to attendees. And it's just something to give some insights on everybody's background and give us a little more familiarity with those who are attending. So that should be popping up on your screen. And so if you want to take a second to fill those out, it should just take a moment. That way we can kind of see what those results are. While you're doing that, I'm going to move over to our agenda for the day, which, as mentioned, is really just three sections. The way we've broken this up, and this follows along, as Patty was alluding to, the new guidebook that we were able to collaborate with the Nature Conservancy on this topic. And so this kind of follows along with that guidebook in a lot of ways. So first is kind of some background on hazard mitigation funding and nature-based solutions. And then Taylor's going to talk about specifically the benefit side of it, which is often the trickiest part of this whole process. And then Amy's going to come in at the end and talk about project tangibles, some of the things that we really like to promote and talk to stakeholders about ways to improve applications, make projects stand out, and some of the things that maybe get overlooked that actually have a lot of value in getting out there. So so with that, I think I will jump on in. So thank you all for those that have replied to the poll questions. So I'm going to begin talking about the background of both hazard mitigation funding through FEMA as well as nature-based solutions, and kind of give that foundational element to the rest of this presentation today. So, why are nature-based solutions important? There's a quote here from the Nature Conservancy, and what you're really looking at here is the foundational element of how natural or green infrastructure can really provide much more comprehensive benefits to our communities, to our quality of life, in many ways beyond what traditional engineered solutions might do by themselves. And so it's just really important to understand that when we talk about nature-based solutions, one of the key components of that conversation is when we talk about those kind of projects for hazard mitigation, we're talking about fundamental projects that are based on those concepts, on those natural systems, as opposed to a solely maybe a normally engineered solution that might have some vegetative components added to it. Really what we're talking about is, when we talk about flooding, hydrologic considerations and flows and how those systems naturally interacted with our regions and communities. So along those lines, it's mentioned that the diverse benefits are a big part of that, looking for ways to get beyond just the hazard risk reduction, but also get those environmental benefits, economic benefits, and societal, quality of life falls under that societal side of it. A lot of times we find nature-based solutions are actually a good way to give communities access back to these natural systems, whether on the coast or riverine systems, or we even talk a little bit in this, although we know it's not as applicable in New Jersey, but it's in the guidebook about wildfire, which has been a big hazard, and it's only increasing as well. So all those concepts really drive why we want to look for those nature-based solutions. One other note is, when we talk about nature-based solutions, one of the challenges that we see is there's a lot of terminology out there. These concepts get floated around quite a bit. And so sometimes, depending also what federal agency or state agency, there's different terms for it. Nature-based solutions is what the FEMA nomenclature is, but depending on where you are, you might hear green or green-gray infrastructure. You may hear about low-impact development. You may hear about ecosystem services. I know even the Corps of Engineers, has engineering with nature. So some entities have their own specific terms. But ultimately, at the end of the day, those all kind of wrap under the same umbrella. So just a quick little housekeeping note there. And speaking of the FEMA side of things, the FEMA hazard mitigation programs that we really are touching on under this presentation discussion in the guidebook that we'll talk about here in a second, are really the FEMA hazard mitigation programs. And so that's the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, which is BRIC. That's the newest program. Flood Mitigation Assistance, FMA, and Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. So those are really the worlds that we're looking at here. And when you think of those programs, there's two main categories. BRIC and FMA are pre-disaster. So those are essentially identifying project needs proactively and looking to fund those for hazard mitigation. HMGP, Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, is post-disaster. So that's after disaster declarations, and that's when funding comes in. And so projects can be applied then as really part of the recovery process. Each program falls within the hazard mitigation program overall within FEMA, so there's a lot of similarities between them. Obviously, BRIC is the newest one. It's been the one that's probably in the headlines the most. And under that umbrella, BRIC is where we're moving into the second year of it. They just awarded the first year this summer. The first year was a little over half a $500 million in funds, and it's just exciting to know that BRIC is increased for the next fiscal year, so it's closer to $1 billion in funds under BRIC. And specifically, the BRIC funds are divided into a couple of buckets. One of the things that can get a little tricky is the difference between a project application that's for implementing a project that's already been studied and evaluated, and there's already a solution identified, and that goes into that third bullet there in the national competition. And that's one essentially where you're submitting a project to compete against all the other projects that are submitted for the main bucket of funds. In 2021 or FY 2021, it's a little over $900 million expected for that funding. But there's also other buckets of funds that each state or territory gets allocated that go towards what they call capability and capacity building activities. And so that's going to be $1 million per state. And so that state is then able to use those funds as they see fit for, it could be for state, staffing, it could be for new studies, investigating and looking into potential projects that will ultimately be submitted to the national competition at a later date. Other ways to support essentially communities to be more prepared to implement these kind of hazard mitigation projects. There's also $25 million expected to be set aside for tribal set aside into 2021 as well, which would be similar in many ways to those state allocations. So a lot of good things happening, and that's just BRIC. Obviously HMGP, because it's post-disaster, that varies significantly year to year, but that's a major funding stream as well. And then FMA, and they each have their own unique characteristics that we discuss within the TNC guidebook that just was released earlier this year. And so, the point of this guidebook that was put together is really to bridge some of the FEMA provided guidance, what we just saw, on the previous slide. FEMA does have a lot of great documentation and guidance out there on their programs, even some on nature-based solutions. And what we wanted to do with this guidebook, or I should say really the Nature Conservancy wanted to do, and we were fortunate to work with them on it, is to kind of bridge that gap, because the FEMA programs can become confused. There's a lot going on, a lot to keep track of, and some of it's not necessarily totally geared towards nature-based solutions specifically. And so what this guidebook does is tries to take an approach to go from the information that's provided at FEMA and specifically help communities and stakeholders walk through the process of how best to conceptualize and apply for funding for nature-based solutions for their specific hazards that they're dealing with. And so under that effort, there's some information related to, in one of the sections that we're talking about the different funding programs. What are the different factors that FMA versus BRIC versus HMGP, and what are in there? What are different program requirements? Trying to lay out in a little bit of a more approachable framework and simplified vision of what some of these elements are that can be at times confusing. And along those lines, one of the things that can also be challenging is understanding the roles of different stakeholders. So trying to lay out the different roles, because some of the different funding, like we just mentioned, some of it's allocated to the state, some of it's a national competition, but you still have to have the state submit on your behalf to that national competition. So understanding who the applicants can be, the states, tribes, territories, and usually the applications are coming from the sub-applicants. So that's your local community, state agencies, and others. But then you also have partners, like the Nature Conservancy or academia or other entities that might want to be involved in a project, but they can't be the actual applicant. And so understanding the different roles and how to make these different components work together is a big part of the application process. And sometimes that's the most confusing part that you need to get past. Aside from the actual funding programs, one of the other things that we talk a little bit about is obviously nature-based solutions themselves. And so when we go back to the overall big picture of mitigating these natural hazards, historically, this top box, gray infrastructure, hard construction, has been the answer. It's the most direct way to deal with hazards usually. You know, our levee system, a flood wall, a seawall, just large, you know, channelized, you know, concrete line channelized waterways, things like that. You know, we're just trying to address, we have problem A, and the quickest solution is solution A. The issue with those, you know, over time has been that there's residual impacts, there's long-term changes, you know, as we go through, you know, increasing volatility in the weather, relative sea level rise, all these changes. Hard infrastructure is much more difficult to adapt in a lot of cases. And the flip side of that is also the bottom box, which is removal, which is certainly still a big part of hazard mitigation, is, you know, avoiding that hazard entirely. So, you know, buyout programs, removal of dams, things like that, where you're essentially trying to entirely remove either exposure to a hazard or that hazard entirely. And what we have and what we're talking about today is nature-based solutions, which kind of falls, you know, I would say in that middle range. And one of the things to note is nature-based solutions doesn't mean excluding either of the other boxes. A lot of the best nature-based solution projects may include some of other components from each of those. You may still need some engineered components for, you know, we talk about coastal flood risk. Storm surge is a massive force. So sometimes, you know, an engineered element may be necessary to mitigate such a large energy, you know, source such as storm surge. But understanding the overall system and building on natural components and foundationally understanding how maybe beaches and dunes need to be part of that equation, or other components with vegetation, you know, is a big part of that. And the same thing on riverine systems. And so nature-based solutions aren't here to exclude the others, but they're here to improve upon them and to make our hazard mitigation solutions more adaptable, by providing more ability to change and evolve over time with changing water levels and other patterns. So just real quick, we're not going to go into a ton of detail on specific mitigation techniques. That would be a whole presentation unto itself. But you know, when we talk about riverine and urban, one of the things that's a good note, as we have some things listed here, is, you know, there's difference in scaling, and Amy will talk about that a little bit later as well. But understanding that, you know, sometimes the solution can be a series of small improvements, you know, greenways, culvert upgrades, just improving drainage to restore hydrology in an area over a series of smaller projects. Or, you know, sometimes you're in need of a large project, which could be, you know, floodplain restoration, or like this example, a horizontal setback levee. So taking what was an engineered solution previously, or would have been an engineered solution, and still building in that robust element that provides flood protection, but doing it in a way that works as a natural system, as that riverine or coastal water body might have functioned on its own. Similarly on the coast, it's the same kind of thing when we talk about, you know, I mentioned beaches and dunes. That's a big piece of this. And just as a note, you know, beaches and dunes do have some caveats when it comes to FEMA funding. Sometimes, depending on what's being done, especially with beach nourishment, sometimes that's not an eligible activity, but it could still be part of a larger project. But even things like you know, living shorelines, one of the things that we do like to note is, you know, that's become a very popular proposed solution a lot of the times for shoreline hazards and erosion and risks along the shorelines. You know, we like to promote the idea of thinking of it as a large system, making sure that there's components in there that provide some redundancy, multiple lines of defense, because a lot of times with like living shoreline, some of those components may not be as robust by themselves, but working as a system, you can start to get some of those effects. And, you know, you may not stop storm surge with the living shoreline, but you may be able to mitigate the wave effects that come on top of that storm surge, which can be a huge hazard reduction by itself. And the last one, we just want to mention it. It was probably not as New Jersey relevant, but you know, mitigation techniques for wildfire. And one of the things that's just an interesting note when it comes to wildfire, you know, we all nationally see it in the news. I feel like more and more every year. It's certainly a big result of clearly, you know, changing weather patterns, climate change, and drought. But it's the youngest, we like to say, of these three hazards that we're talking about. And it's interesting to see as techniques and solutions are starting to evolve, and watching that kind of take place in this field. So so it's been a nice little progression through those. And I think I'm going to jump into a little break and talk about some questions and answers. So I don't know if our team has any good questions that might have been brought up, or any items that we might want to cover. I saw the poll results. Have you worked on nature-based solutions for hazard mitigation? And it seems like 50-50. So that's always interesting to get different exposure on that. It's a little bit more on the no than the yes, but we're always excited to try and grow that. I think that's what we've seen, is there's just a desire right now from stakeholders to want to do nature-based solutions, but a lot of the challenges is how do we make that happen? How do we fund it? And which is exactly what we're hoping to help with today. Have you completed an application through FEMA's hazard mitigation grant program? The majority say no. There's some that said yes and they got funded, one that yes, it wasn't funded. Thoughts with those that made it through that process. It can be challenging, and and understanding who's been through that, and when you gather your stakeholders together, that can be a huge resource to have with you, helping you go through that application process. The third polling question was your familiarity with quantifying benefits using something like FEMA's BCA Toolkit? There's a smaller percentage has a lot of experience with that. I would say half, it looks like, we're about familiar with it, and then a third have no experience with benefit cost analysis. And so that's going to be something that Tayler is going to talk about here in a second. Trying to make it a little bit more approachable, and just to bring those concepts down a little bit. So hopefully those that are familiar will get a little bit more insight and be closer to being able to employ that down the road. And then what entities do you primarily partner with on these projects? So communities, adjacent communities, and the state are the biggest two, which is pretty normal. But it's also great to see private nonprofits and partners and universities being on that list as well. One of the things that Amy is going to talk about later, I think, is really making those partnerships, and how having a broader group of stakeholders really can increase the likelihood of getting a project funded. So before I hand off to Tayler to go into the next section, I guess, do we have any questions that we wanted to answer now, or do we want to wait till later? Let's see. Or Tayler, I guess, or do you want to pick up now, Tayler, or do we have any questions?
Sure, I'm happy to get started. If we have questions come in, we can circle back to them.
Okay, sounds good. All right, well, I'll hand off to Tayler, and she'll talking about the benefits.
Cool, thank you. Could you go to the next slide? Thank you. Okay, so the next thing we wanted to cover with this presentation is how to highlight the benefits that any one project could bring to the table, so to speak, as part of a federal grant application. So I guess as our poll showed, about 10% of the people on this call have past experience with submitting grant applications for federal funding for hazard mitigation projects, and the other 90% don't, but maybe you're attending this call because you might be considering it down the line. So anyway, the goal with this section is to just talk through how to capture all the benefits that you or the applicant can, so that the project is shown in its best light and has the best chance of a successful application. Next slide. So the first thing to understand about submitting an application is basically that the economic benefits of the project, the quantitative benefits, need to be shown to exceed the cost of implementing the project. So in other words, pretty simply, your benefit cost ratio, or your BCR, needs to be greater than 1. For FEMA, in order to calculate that BCR, they have what's called their benefit cost analysis tool, or the BCA toolkit. It's a Microsoft Excel-based tool, and they require applicants to use it to compute the BCR for a project and show that that's greater than 1. So just to show that the costs exceed the benefits. And so to do that, the users input their known costs into that Excel-based tool, and also the project outputs that they're expecting from the project. And then, the tool will help compute the BCR. When costs are entered for a particular project, all of the HMA grant programs require a detailed budget, beginning with design and going through the post-construction analysis. The benefits are then, they're calculated as the incremental difference between the existing and future conditions without the project, compared to the conditions that are expected after the project is completed. And then the toolkit also does recognize some pre-calculated benefits for certain categories, which just means that FEMA has already computed the benefits for a particular mitigation strategy for a specific scale that it might be implemented at. So for example, the dollars for property that's elevated in a special flood hazard area is one, or the dollars for every acre of post-wildfire mitigation is another. And so if all of the project components of your project can receive that BCR of greater than 1 using FEMA's, using those standard pre-calculated benefits alone, then you don't actually need to use the BCA tool. You can just include justification that you meet the threshold for the BCR. But in most cases, FEMA does require that that tool be used to compute the benefit cost analysis, and any variance from that tool is something that needs to be requested and approved. So for instance, that might apply to your case if you've already had a full economic analysis completed. And then outside, so for this slide, outside of FEMA's pre-calculated benefits, there's also a list of traditional benefits that are recognized by the toolkit. So the left-hand, oh, Chris, if you could go back. Thank you. On the left-hand side, so these are the traditional benefits that could apply to all projects that are seeking grant funding for hazard mitigation. So that, avoided physical damage, the avoided loss of function costs, avoided casualties, and emergency management costs. And then on the right-hand side, what we're showing is additional benefits that might be applicable for projects that have nature-based components. So riparian space created as an example, green open space, acreage created, and et cetera. For nature-based projects, basically all of the possible benefits that are listed here can be considered for that nature-based solution. So both items from the left-hand side and the right-hand side. And then whenever possible, the appreciative value of nature-based solutions should be considered and included as part of the quantified benefits for your grant application. Next slide. So within the BCA toolkit itself that FEMA has, there are some pre-calculations for the ecosystem services that are provided by nature-based solutions. Ecosystem services, they aren't really intended to be the primary economic driver behind projects, and they're really just supposed to be considered added benefits. So the table that is shown here on the right has the 5 ecosystem service categories that FEMA currently recognizes. So green open space, riparian, forest, wetland, marine, and estuary. And then it indicates which, with the X's, it indicates which ecosystem services are valued in the toolkit. And then one note we have here is that the values can actually only be captured for new or restored habitat and not simply for preservation of space. So whenever you have a project that is preserving space, that should be discussed qualitatively in your project narrative. If you do have any supporting documentation, so an academic study or something along those lines that would allow your team to value additional ecosystem benefits, you can calculate these outside of the BCA toolkit and provide them for additional justification. But since FEMA does require use of their tool, it has to be, you have to still show your BCR is greater than 1 using their tool first. Similarly, if you know of other ecosystem service benefits, but you don't have the capacity or resources to compute or monetize what those might be, you can and should at least discuss them qualitatively in your project narrative. One last note for this section, sea level rise is currently the only future condition that FEMA includes in the toolkit. So any other effects of climate change, changing demographics for an area, changes in employment or land use, those aren't currently included in the toolkit or captured by it. Okay, next slide. So those last couple slides really were kind of the main focus was the quantitative benefits. The qualitative benefits, it probably goes without saying that these are any benefits that can only be discussed in narrative format with respect to the positive impacts that are expected for the project, and they're anything that can't be directly monetized, either because the data is not available or you simply don't have the resources to do so. For qualitative benefits within the guidebook, we've done our best to be fairly comprehensive with any supporting benefits that a nature-based project might be able to achieve. And so the next couple of slides just show some examples of what these benefits might be for the primary hazards that Chris mentioned. So for riverine and urban flooding, for coastal flooding, and for wildfires. So for riverine and urban flooding, these include things like preventing development in flood-prone areas, soil and bank stabilization, sediment capture. The next slide. For coastal flooding, having some discussions related to wind and wave attenuation that might not be able to be quantified, sea level rise mitigation if there are kind of additional considerations outside of whatever is included already within FEMA's BCA tool. And then, there are some crossovers as well. So soil and bank stabilization is included again because it does apply to both coastal flooding and riverine and urban flooding. And then next slide. And for wildfires, just to hear that we noted landside protection and improved evacuation and supply access routes. For any of the primary hazards, there may be other qualitative benefits that your team can think of. So if there are benefits that were listed as quantitative and you don't have capabilities to quantify them, again, you can list them as qualitative benefits and kind of treat them as such throughout the narrative. And then as far as co-benefits are concerned, so co-benefits are the positive side effects that are generated by projects but aren't directly related to the project's primary function of hazard mitigation or risk reduction. So in the case of nature-based solutions, flood hazard mitigation projects that are designed to increase flood resilience, for instance, they could also expand species habitat or improve regional water quality or increase adjacent property values. Those would be co-benefits that aren't necessarily direct output of the flood hazard mitigation project itself. So I'm sure there are others you can think of. And oftentimes the co-benefits will fall into one of these 4 categories that we've listed here. So economic opportunities, reduced social vulnerability, cultural resources, or multi-hazard mitigation. And those are just kind of categories to frame your thinking around. We do have some co-benefits listed within the guidebook, but a lot of them are project specific that can then be included by your team. In most cases, in our experience, co-benefits tend to fall on the qualitative side. And so we've listed them here. In some cases, you might find that there are some quantifiable co-benefits. So you might be able to quantify economic benefits, for instance, that's achieved indirectly from a project through things like reducing interruptions to supply chains downstream. So something along those lines. So in most cases, we found that co-benefits tend to be discussed qualitatively, but in some cases, you might have the opportunity to make them, to monetize them. Next slide. One other thing we wanted to note, and is noted in the guidebook related to qualitative benefits, is that FEMA, particularly with the new BRIC program, grant program that it's developed, they came out with what they call community lifelines to classify project benefits. There are some boosts to an application score for applications that are submitted directly to the BRIC program by tying your narrative into the different community lifelines that FEMA has and describing how the project considers the lifelines in its planning and design phases, or just otherwise incorporates them into the overall project. So in order to maximize the effect of your narrative in an application, we do recommend trying to hit on where your project addresses or incorporates any of the lifelines that are shown here. And while that's primarily a recommendation for the BRIC program, since FEMA did develop them more recently for that program, it does seem to be a direction that FEMA is moving in general. So we do think it could actually be a useful exercise for any of FEMA's hazard mitigation assistance grants. So for the FMA or the HMGP grants as well. Next slide. And then lastly, one of our biggest tips that we have is really to try and tell the project story for your project within your grant application. And the way we kind of think about it is that any grant application reviewer, they're going to be reading through hundreds probably of applications. So anything that you can do to kind of tie the pieces together and really drive the story home is going to be helpful and also engaging for whoever the reviewer happens to be. And so having a clear progression of how the economic, social, and environmental benefits, both quantitative and qualitative, that your project has, how they fit in with one another, what stakeholders are involved, and Amy will get a little bit into that in our next section. But tying all of that together into one cohesive story, we found is helpful as far as bringing the biggest impact from your application, and hopefully achieving an award through that. So yeah, we hope this graphic is somewhat helpful for kind of tying some of those ideas together. Next slide, I think. Yeah, so that's kind of probably a pretty quick overview of how to capture project benefits from a nature-based project, both quantitatively and qualitatively. I don't know if we had any questions that came up on this, but we're happy to take any.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions that we're gonna touch on real quick, Taylor. So thank
Awesome.
you.
Sure, thank you.
So one question was, we got a question asking whether FEMA would be considering future precipitation or heat for projects, and if not, why not? And I think one of the challenges when it comes to FEMA hazard mitigation grant applications and future conditions is there's two things. There's really the quantifiable benefits, which when it comes to FEMA applications, a lot of times when you're talking about quantifying benefits, in most cases, those are going to be based on existing scenarios and existing conditions for the most part. But what they are building into programs like BRIC and others with some of these qualitative benefits in the project scoring is the ability to show that long-term understanding of how a project could have longevity and mitigate those concerns over the long term. So from what we've seen, and I'll defer also to Amy here in a second and let her chime in, is we've seen it's a challenge to build those considerations into quantifying and getting your benefit cost ratio over 1, but it's becoming a lot more feasible and actually almost necessary in a lot of cases with competitive scoring to have those considerations built into your project for that competitive side of it. I don't know, Amy, do you have any other notes on that particular question?
Thanks, Chris. So specifically in BRIC, in the qualitative scoring, they've outlined out of 20 available points this year. So 20% of the qualitative score, once you kind of get through the pass fail, I shouldn't say pass fail, the all or nothing scoring for each of those, the quantitative components or the technical scoring, 20% is on future conditions. So there's a large component and emphasis built into the BRIC program so that projects are being put forward that are taking into consideration, not just saying that we've taken into consideration future conditions, but being able to fully show that you've taken into consideration what models have you used, what analyses, what types of future conditions are you taking into account, as Tayler noted. Are you looking at the climatology? Are you looking at population changes or demographic changes? Those components. So I think that's built into the actual program evaluation, which is awesome. There's another component that I think is starting to come back now. For those that remembered Executive Order 13, I'm trying to remember the correct number, 13. 690, which was the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, FFRMS, back to administrations ago. In the current administration, they have brought that back. And so in the current BRIC cycle, there is a partial implementation of that. It's now incorporated into a new executive order. So I apologize, I don't have that number off the top of my head. But as part of that, from at least the flood and precipitation standard, they are looking to say, let's look at how we incorporate future flood conditions into the equation. So this kind of reinvigoration of FFRMS is coming back into play as one of the elements that needs to be included as projects are designed for flood reduction or flood mitigation. So I think there's multiple ways that they're trying to address these. Unfortunately, I think in some areas that research has been advanced in terms of precipitation changes much more, much further in the flood world, and having it be able to be directly related to benefits and the impacts on our projects and in the implementation. And some of the other changes, like the heat changes, those aren't as universally adopted yet. And so I think that's, as those get further and further documented, I think we'll see those incorporated in future cycles and iterations as part of the future conditions.
Yeah, those are good points, Amy. And I know one quick note, just to tie this back, one of the advantages of really promoting these nature-based solutions is exactly, what we were just talking about. Inherently, these are the types of projects and mitigation projects that should do well with that long-term understanding when done right. And so that's a big part of promoting nature-based solutions, and a big reason why we see them as having a lot more opportunities to get funding going forward. Real quick, before we head off to Amy for the last section, we also had a question about how would you quantify co-benefits for a flood buyout? For example, less maintenance, operation and maintenance. You wouldn't have emergency responders having to rescue people in a lot of cases. One of the challenges with the FEMA specific BCA tool is quantifying those co-benefits. It can be a little challenging. There are some other tools out there that you can start to, I think, quantify more of these co-benefits in more comprehensive fashion. So you may have restrictions in what you can quantify for that BCR under the co-benefits, and ultimately some of those co-benefits might not carry the quantified weight of removing the structures comparatively. You're going to probably get the majority of your benefits from that reduced exposure, but so it's a little challenging, I think, to quantify it, but it's definitely going back once again to the qualitative, and Tayler mentioned the project story. I think showing a comprehensive understanding of how this doing a buyout isn't just the buyouts. There's these other co-benefits and these other connected components is a big part of that, and making sure to weave that into and especially, a lot of times buyouts are part of a multi-phase project. There may be future use. There could be future flood mitigation plans, floodplain restoration and other things with that land that the buyouts are happening on. So a lot of times some of the benefits can also be captured in that qualitative fashion by just at least elaborating upon, that the big picture and what the overall project may look like. So I'm going to hand over, Amy, to you to go through the last section, the project intangibles, before we wrap up. So take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. One other point, Tayler, Nordstrom, I just want to make sure on the buyouts, can you chime in just to remind folks on the predetermined benefit component?
Yeah, right. So one of FEMA's pre-calculated benefits, in addition to elevating structures, they include buyouts as part of that. So it's based on the number of properties that are removed from the SFHA.
Right.
So that would be a place to look. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so to me, when you're doing a buyout or acquisition, one of the first places to go is the predetermined benefits. And if those aren't giving you everything you need, then you can go to some of those co-benefits and tie into now some of these project intangibles. But hopefully if you're in the SFHA doing a buyout, those predetermined or pre-calculated benefits will be sufficient enough to carry you from a BCR standpoint that the co-benefits wouldn't be needed, but they should always be highlighted just from an intangible standpoint. Okay, so project intangibles, this is the other elements that can really make your project successful, especially in the nature-based solution world. And they're often sometimes the most difficult to describe and the most elusive. So Chris, next slide. So we talk about these from an approach and strategy standpoint, because these really are integral to the success of a project application, but success of a project itself, and need to be done upfront and be thought of upfront. So we're going to touch on these a little bit on each one, but your project scale, the stakeholders you're involving in, the residual benefits that you hope to bring out. Project scale, how big or small do you want to go? Oftentimes there's this assumption that, well, I need to request just the amount that's needed to get this project through. Well, sometimes your benefits actually can be better if your project's larger, and looking to incorporate more efforts with adjacent communities, and that can actually make your project look a little more enticing. Stakeholders and partnerships is a big component this year in BRIC. And then obviously the residual benefits and other components that are going to come out is something that just tells your story. And whenever we're talking mitigation grants, whether it's a FEMA grant or a HUD or NRCS or anything, we always tell folks it's important to make sure you tell your story and make the case on why this project is so critical. Chris, next slide. So the project scale, as I kind of mentioned, oftentimes increasing the project scale can broaden your benefits. And it's not just, I think, increasing it haphazardly, but specifically with nature-based solutions in the BRIC program, there is an emphasis on community-wide projects, and so, or regional projects, these larger scale efforts. So when you look and you have a solution or an issue that you're trying to solve for in one small area of your community, if you can connect that and build a larger project to another portion, another area of your project or another area of your community that needs that work, that larger scale, inherently can, yes, it can cost more, but those additional benefits where you're connecting it through the community will increase some of your residual benefits and your co-benefits, but also can increase your calculated benefits. Just because it's improving that whole landscape and ecosystem and having the effect on a community-wide, as opposed to the phrase we often hear, the checkerboard effect, that are sometimes associated with a single buyout or elevation. Chris, next slide. So when you're thinking the residual benefits, this ties in, I think, again, with your project scale. It's, these three elements that we're highlighting really work in cohesion together. It's project scale will lead to your residual benefits because it's thinking broader than just that initial area that we're all taught to look at when we're trying to solve the problem. But as you look and you're trying to identify the solution that will solve your immediate need in your area, whether it's a riverine or a coastal project, as you think broader and you look to your community itself and you think about the additional benefits that can happen, these are what are your residual benefits. And so this is what is, to me, the wonderful sell in any grant application. Oftentimes it's being able to address more than one hazard. It can be involving more stakeholders, but the ultimate outcome here is that you have a project that's more compelling, not just from a mitigation standpoint, but from a community development and recovery standpoint. I have a couple examples I can give a little bit later on these. Chris, next slide. And stakeholders, the project scale and the residual benefits can't be developed in a vacuum. And so the stakeholders are just integral to understanding what you want to develop from your project scale, what's the right scale, but also what benefits that you think your project's going to be able to produce. And so these partners, getting them involved as early as possible. One of the reasons why we asked the question in the poll, can enhance your mitigation application. In fact, in the BRIC application cycle this year, there is a whole evaluation factor in the qualitative component on partnerships. Who are you partnering with? What are the outcomes? What are their involvements? And there's even a more specific component on working with economically disadvantaged communities and the partnerships around here or around those elements. And so partnerships are often looked at just for, I think, the implementation side and being able to get things moving as quickly as possible once you want to break ground. But partnerships can help you evaluate, bring in additional funding, resources, but not just dollar resources. Some studies that folks have been looking for, they can, if you're partnering with the university, they may be able to give you the study that can serve as the qualitative benefit for some of your co-benefits that you're putting in the application. A lot of these partnerships oftentimes apply for other grants, and so you can use these partners as support in your grant application development in and of itself. They can be your subject matter experts as you're developing these, because this tight-knit world of mitigation, folks are out there oftentimes applying for grants in many areas. So pick people's brains. They know a lot of ways of doing this, and these stakeholders and these partners are great at getting it done. Chris, next slide. And so I think there's some general challenges as you look at the scale and residual benefits across the board. And we've been looking here at flood and wildfire. Wildfire, as we mentioned, with the heat component of future conditions, just wildfire mitigation has a smaller history, right? And so those are harder to put forward in a project scale and complexity. Flood hazard has tremendous history in our nature-based solutions, but that history leads to a complexity. As me as an engineer, we like to do our analysis and our modeling, and can oftentimes get in the way early on. And then the other challenge with addressing your project scale and scope and partnerships is making sure that you can address both your immediate and long-term needs. So these are important, but I think one of the things to think about too is you want to avoid pitfalls, and that's only some of the pitfalls that we see happening often are only focusing on the ancillary benefits, those side components that FEMA may not actually score or quantify in a BCR, and just looking at federal project funding limitations. There are such things as no free money, right? We always say that federal projects often come with limitations, but developing a strategy on how to work around those limitations, bring in additional funds, and maximize those resources of other stakeholders that can come in and support you is really critical and an important part of any strategy you have. Chris, next slide. So I'll leave that there for questions and answers, but there is, if there's time, if people want to hear a good example, we've got a couple that can be given on kind of scaling and scoping with some nature-based solutions. But Chris, I think we can go to some other just general questions if folks have it.
I think Taylor is going to cover one outstanding question. Taylor, if you want to take
Perfect.
one.
Yeah, so we did have one question that basically, if there are any kind of good repositories for research or academic studies that could be used to help provide some of the quantitative benefits as additional justification outside of the BCA tool. And there are some good kind of databases and also tools that can help, at least at a high level, compute some of these values. So some of the ones that Chris had dropped, the EDGE Economic Decision Guide software from NIST into the chat, and then Patty's sending some additional sites. So there's the Nature Conservancy has the EASY tool, ESII. The Natural Capital Project has some what they're called invest models. And then the Environment and Climate Change Canada has its EVRY database, EVRI, that does include some, US and North American information as well. So studies and research and that sort of thing. One thing to note on that, we have run into some challenges with doing benefit transfers from academic studies to a specific locale. So that's something that just to watch out for. It's not always easy to make that transfer one-to-one. If it's a large enough project, it's also something that maybe a project proponent could, if it's a large enough project and the time frame is long enough to allow this, project proponents could potentially, partner with academic institutions or something along those lines to kind of collect data that might be needed as well. So that hopefully is a good list for y'all.
Great, thank you, Taylor. And I think with that we're pretty much at our time, and we want to be cognizant of everybody's time. So we tried to hit up, I think, most of the questions that had popped up. If anything else comes up, certainly we're happy to follow up. As Amy mentioned, there's some really good examples scattered around the country of these kind of projects, and we're getting more and more of these each day. The guidebook itself, the Nature Conservancy's guidebook, has some case studies in the back of it for each of the 3 type of hazards that we talked about today. And there's always looking for other opportunities kind of scattered around. So thank you all. And I guess, Carrie, I'll hand over to you.
If I could just add in, so I'm sorry, just to jump in very quickly, I apologize. The last link that I included in the chat is to the Nature Conservancy's Naturally Resilient Communities website, which is a good complement to this. It includes a lot of additional case studies, as well as some resources to help think about in different examples around nature-based solutions.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for this wonderful presentation and for answering all these questions. On behalf of all of us here at the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center, we'd once again like to thank Chris Levitz, Amy Baker, and Tayler Nordstrom for their presentations, as well as Erica Harris, Taylor Tharaldson, Kristen Tremaine-Javis, and Patty Dewar for being here on our panel and also helping to answer some questions and provide some resources. We hope that you will all join us for our next Climate Academy event. Please look for an announcement in your inbox or continue to check the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center website for updates. That concludes today's event, and thank you for joining us.